this episode, we take a step back from individual risk events and look at the bigger ideas that help an organization assess risk in a disciplined and repeatable way. Up to this point, the discussion in the Certified in Risk and Information Systems Control (CRISC) path has focused on events, impacts, threats, vulnerabilities, and scenarios. But none of that work stays reliable for long unless the organization shares a common understanding of what risk assessment is supposed to accomplish and how it should be performed. That is where concepts, standards, and frameworks become so important. They give structure to thinking that might otherwise be inconsistent from one team to the next, one assessor to the next, or one business unit to the next. For a brand new learner, this topic matters because it explains why mature organizations do not assess risk by instinct alone. They rely on common ideas, common language, and organized approaches so that assessment results are useful for decision-making instead of becoming a pile of opinions that cannot be compared or defended. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. At its core, risk assessment is the process of examining what could interfere with the organization's objectives and determining how serious that exposure may be under current conditions. That sounds simple at first, but it includes several important layers. The organization has to understand what it is trying to protect, what events could cause harm, what conditions make those events plausible, how likely those events are, and what sort of business consequences could follow if they occur. A good assessment is not just a list of technical flaws, and it is not only a compliance exercise designed to satisfy a review requirement. Its real purpose is to help leaders and owners make better decisions by giving them a clearer picture of uncertainty, consequence, and priority. When risk assessment is done well, it creates a bridge between technical reality and business judgment. When it is done poorly, the organization may still collect a great deal of data, but that data will not reliably guide action because the logic underneath it will be weak or inconsistent. One of the first core concepts in any assessment is context, because risk has meaning only in relation to something the organization is trying to achieve. A weakness in a low-value internal tool may deserve attention, but it does not carry the same weight as a weakness in a payment platform, a clinical system, or a major customer service channel. That is why assessors begin by asking what process, service, data set, or business objective is under review and what dependencies surround it. Scope matters as well, because an assessment that tries to cover everything at once usually becomes too vague to be useful, while an assessment that is too narrow may miss important dependencies and shared exposures. Context also includes the environment around the business, such as industry expectations, third-party relationships, legal obligations, operational timing, and the criticality of the service involved. Without context, people often argue about the seriousness of a risk without realizing they are imagining different business situations. With context, the assessment becomes anchored to the actual environment where the risk will either matter greatly or matter far less than it first appears. Another major concept is the use of risk criteria, which means the organization needs a way to decide what counts as low concern, moderate concern, or serious concern in its own environment. This is where ideas like likelihood, impact, risk appetite, and risk tolerance begin to work together in a practical way. Likelihood helps describe how plausible an event is under current conditions, while impact helps explain what kind of damage or disruption the organization would experience if the event occurred. Appetite and tolerance provide the business lens that determines how much uncertainty leadership is willing to live with in pursuit of objectives. Without shared criteria, two teams may look at the same scenario and reach very different conclusions simply because each is using a different mental scale. Risk assessment frameworks, therefore, encourage organizations to define their criteria in advance so that comparisons are more meaningful and reporting becomes more consistent. The goal is not to eliminate judgment, because judgment is always involved. The goal is to make judgment more disciplined, more transparent, and more aligned with how the business actually chooses to operate. Another concept that deserves careful attention is the difference between qualitative and quantitative assessment, because many new learners assume one must be superior in every case. Qualitative assessment relies on reasoned categories, descriptive scales, expert input, and business judgment to compare risks when precise data is limited or when the environment is too complex for exact numeric modeling. Quantitative assessment tries to express likelihood, impact, or expected loss in more measurable terms, often using financial estimates, frequency assumptions, or historical evidence. Both approaches can be useful, and both can become weak if handled carelessly. Numbers can create false confidence if the assumptions behind them are poor, and descriptive categories can become vague if they are not tied to clear criteria and evidence. Mature organizations often use some blend of the two depending on the decision at hand, the quality of available data, and the importance of the affected objective. The important lesson for CRISC learners is that strong assessment does not come from looking mathematical. It comes from using a method that is consistent, defensible, and appropriate for the business situation being analyzed. It is also important to understand that assessment concepts are connected rather than separate. Assets, threats, vulnerabilities, controls, risk events, and business impacts are not different lists sitting side by side with no relationship to one another. A useful assessment connects them into a meaningful explanation of exposure. The organization looks at what it values, considers what could cause harm, identifies weaknesses that make harm more plausible, evaluates the controls that should reduce that exposure, and then examines what the resulting business consequences might be if those conditions align in the wrong way. This is one reason scenario thinking is so helpful inside risk assessment. It gives structure to the relationships between these concepts instead of treating each one as an isolated technical observation. When learners begin hearing the connections clearly, risk assessment becomes much easier to understand. It stops sounding like a vocabulary list and starts sounding like a business reasoning process that explains how uncertainty moves from a condition in the environment to a consequence that leadership must take seriously. At this point, it helps to separate standards from frameworks, because beginners often use those words as if they mean the same thing. A standard usually provides documented principles, requirements, or guidance about what good practice should include, while a framework gives a more organized structure for how work should be arranged, discussed, and repeated across the organization. A method is slightly different again, because it refers more specifically to the technique used to analyze or score risk, such as workshops, matrices, scenarios, interviews, or financial estimation models. This distinction matters because a company may follow a recognized standard, organize its governance through a framework, and still use a locally tailored method for performing detailed assessments. Confusing these layers can lead people to expect a single document to do everything at once, which is rarely how mature risk programs operate. Standards help define good practice. Frameworks help organize activity and accountability, and methods help teams perform the actual assessment work. Together, they support consistency, but they do not remove the need for judgment, context, or business awareness. Organizations rely on standards and frameworks because they create common language and repeatable structure in environments where different teams may otherwise interpret risk in very different ways. A technology team might focus on system weakness, a business team might focus on service disruption, and a legal or compliance team might focus on obligations and reporting thresholds. None of those views is wrong, but without an agreed structure, the conversation can become fragmented and difficult to compare across departments. Standards and frameworks help solve that problem by giving assessors a shared reference point for how to define scope, how to think about impact, what evidence to consider, how to document findings, and how to communicate results upward. They also make risk work more resilient over time because the process does not depend entirely on the style or memory of one individual. When people change roles, when the organization grows, or when regulators and customers ask how assessments are performed, a framework-based approach helps the business explain its logic more clearly. That consistency is one of the biggest reasons frameworks matter in both governance and day-to-day risk practice. There are several well-known approaches that organizations draw from, and the important thing for a beginner is to understand the differences in emphasis rather than trying to memorize every detail. Many organizations use NIST guidance because it offers practical structure and a strong connection between assessment, controls, and risk-based decision-making. Others draw from control objectives for information and related technologies, COBIT, because it is especially useful for connecting information and technology governance to business objectives, accountability, and enterprise oversight. Many organizations also rely on international standards that provide broad principles for enterprise risk management and more focused guidance for information security risk assessment. These approaches do not all look identical, but they often share common themes such as context, identification, analysis, evaluation, documentation, and ongoing review. The point is not that one framework is always correct and the others are wrong. The point is that mature organizations usually choose a recognized structure so their assessment work has consistency, credibility, and a defensible connection to accepted practice rather than being improvised from scratch every time. Even when an organization chooses a strong framework, tailoring still matters because no standard or framework understands the business better than the people operating inside it. A hospital, an online retailer, a defense contractor, a utility provider, and a small software company may all use risk assessment concepts that sound familiar, but the way those concepts are applied will differ based on mission, regulation, tolerance for downtime, customer expectations, and third-party dependencies. A rigid copy-and-paste approach can create a process that looks mature on paper while failing to match operational reality. That is why assessors need to understand not only the framework itself, but also the business model, the decision culture, and the kinds of risk that truly matter most in that environment. Good tailoring does not mean ignoring the framework whenever it feels inconvenient. It means preserving the discipline structure while adjusting the detail, language, evidence sources, and reporting style so the assessment remains useful to the organization that must actually act on it. A framework is supposed to organize judgment, not replace it with blind routine. Most strong standards and frameworks follow a broadly familiar pattern, even when they use different wording. The organization establishes context, defines scope, identifies risks, analyzes likelihood and impact, compares the results against its criteria, documents the conclusions, and uses the output to support decisions about priority, ownership, and later treatment. That does not mean the process is strictly linear in every situation. Sometimes new information discovered during analysis forces the scope to be refined or the business consequence to be reconsidered. Still, the recurring pattern matters because it shows that risk assessment is more than a one-time brainstorming session. It is a structured cycle of understanding and evaluation that can be repeated over time as conditions change. This shared pattern is one reason different frameworks can still feel familiar to one another. They are usually trying to solve the same business problem, which is helping the organization understand uncertainty in a disciplined way so that decisions are based on clearer reasoning rather than instinct, noise, or whichever team happens to speak most forcefully in the moment. One of the biggest misconceptions about standards and frameworks is that simply adopting one automatically makes risk assessment mature. In reality, a framework can be present on paper while the underlying practice remains weak. An organization may have a policy, a template, and a scoring scale, yet still perform shallow assessments if scope is unclear, evidence is weak, ownership is missing, or business context is ignored. Another common misconception is that risk assessment is just a compliance ritual, something done once a year to satisfy audit or regulatory expectations before attention moves elsewhere. That approach misses the point entirely. Risk assessment is supposed to help decision-makers understand change, prioritize effort, and see exposure more clearly as the environment evolves. It is also a mistake to assume that tools or dashboards can replace the thinking that frameworks are meant to organize. Tools can store information and help with comparison, but they do not create judgment on their own. The value of a framework comes from how it shapes disciplined thinking, not from the appearance of formality by itself. Another mistake is becoming overly attached to scoring without remembering why the scoring exists. Numbers, ratings, and heat maps can be useful, but only when they reflect sound concepts, good evidence, and stable criteria. If the organization treats the score as the whole assessment, it may miss the conditions, assumptions, and business consequences that make the number meaningful in the first place. This is where frameworks can help by reminding teams that a risk assessment should explain why the risk matters, not only where it lands on a visual scale. A slightly lower scored risk affecting a critical business function may deserve more attention than a louder issue with a higher score in a less consequential part of the environment. Strong assessors therefore read beyond the label and use the framework to keep the bigger picture in view. They ask whether the logic is clear, whether the evidence supports the conclusion, whether the scenario is credible, and whether the result is useful for leadership action. That mindset is far more valuable than memorizing categories without understanding the reasoning beneath them. When risk assessment concepts, standards, and frameworks are used well, they support much more than the assessment meeting itself. They improve the quality of the risk register, strengthen reporting to management, help business owners understand why certain issues matter, and create a more stable foundation for later decisions about response, monitoring, and governance oversight. They also help the organization compare unlike risks with greater consistency, because the same logic can be applied across applications, vendors, processes, and business units even when the details vary. For learners, one of the most important takeaways is that you do not need to memorize every framework document to think well about this topic. What matters most is understanding why organizations use these structures, what common problems they are trying to solve, and what sound assessment looks like when concepts, criteria, context, and evidence all work together. Once that logic becomes clear, named frameworks feel much less intimidating because you can see the shared reasoning running through them instead of viewing each one as a completely separate world. By the end of this discussion, risk assessment concepts, standards, and frameworks should feel less like competing jargon and more like the organized foundation that helps risk work stay credible, useful, and consistent. The concepts explain how to think about uncertainty, consequence, criteria, and business context. Standards describe what sound practice should look like, while frameworks provide a structured way to carry that practice out across the organization over time. Methods then help teams perform the actual analysis in a form that leaders can understand and use. This matters because risk assessment is only valuable when it supports real decisions about priority, accountability, and business exposure. When you understand the concepts clearly and see how standards and frameworks support disciplined judgment, you are building exactly the kind of thinking CRISC is trying to develop. You are learning not just how to find risk, but how to assess it in a way that the organization can trust, compare, communicate, and act upon with confidence.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.